Virginia, 1853. On the surface, the Whitmore plantation looks like a picture of perfection, white columns gleaming in the sun, sprawling fields, and the hum of wealth and order. But behind those elegant walls hides a secret so dark it's barely whispered aloud. A powerful matriarch, feared and respected, has twisted her control into something unimaginable, affecting lives in ways no outsider could see. Stick with us, and we'll uncover the hidden truths of this plantation's shadowed history. Margaret Whitmore was a woman you couldn't ignore. At 38, she moved through the Whitmore mansion like a queen, her posture perfect, her voice calm but commanding. People admired her charm, her intelligence, and the way she seemed to have everything under control. To neighbors and visiting families, she was the ideal Southern matriarch, the kind of woman whose presence demanded respect, even envy. But behind that elegance, there was something far more complicated. Margaret's control extended far beyond the polished floors of her home. She ruled over her household with an iron hand, shaping every aspect of life on the plantation, from her sons' upbringing to the labor and movements of every enslaved person under her roof. Obedience wasn't just expected. It was demanded, enforced through fear and intimidation. No slip of the tongue, no misstep, no question went unnoticed. Margaret's sons grew up under her exacting watch. She taught them to respect authority, follow rules, and mirror her own idea of perfection. But her influence went beyond guidance. She instilled in them an obedience that was both unwavering and, over time, deeply troubling. Her household wasn't just a home. It was a training ground for control, where even love and family could be manipulated into tools of power. Outwardly, Margaret was the perfect hostess. She entertained in polished parlors with laughter, charm, and flawless grace. Guests saw only elegance, fine china, music filling the halls, conversations filled with wit and poise. But the reality behind closed doors was starkly different. Every servant, every child, every corner of the estate felt her presence and her influence. Fear and tension were woven into the everyday life of the plantation. Invisible to outsiders, but ever present to those who lived there. Even the servants spoke of her quietly, their voices hushed, calling her the mistress with a mix of reverence and dread. Her control wasn't only physical, it was psychological. People obeyed because they feared the consequences of defiance. Yes, but also because her influence shaped how they saw themselves and their place in the world. No one, not even her own family, dared openly challenge her. Margaret Whitmore was brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. Her mind was sharp, her presence commanding, and her ability to maintain appearances unmatched. To the outside world, she was flawless. To those who lived in her shadow, she was relentless. And beneath the surface of that refinement, a darker truth simmered, a secret that would ultimately define her legacy and haunt everyone bound to her household. This is the woman at the center of our story. She was admired, feared, and respected, a matriarch whose influence stretched far beyond the halls of her mansion, shaping lives in ways both visible and invisible. And as we follow the story of Margaret Whitmore, you'll see how power, secrecy, and obsession collided on one Virginia plantation, leaving a mark that would be felt for generations. The Whitmore plantation was a world of contrasts. From a distance, it looked like a slice of paradise, white columns gleaming in the sun, neatly trimmed gardens, and rolling fields stretching as far as the eye could see. Visitors would have admired the elegance, the order, the sense that everything on the estate was perfect and under control. But the truth beneath that beauty was far more complicated and far darker. Life for the enslaved people began before dawn. Men and women moved silently through the fields, hands blistered from labor, backs bent from endless work. The children carried water, gathered firewood, or assisted in chores far beyond their years. Every action was watched by overseers by Margaret, and by the unspoken rules of the plantation itself. One misstep, one hesitation, could bring punishment or public humiliation. Margaret's influence was everywhere. She knew the names, the families, the habits, and even the fears of those under her control. She assigned work with precision, dictated schedules, and corrected behavior without mercy. Life on the plantation wasn't just about labor. It was about control, obedience, and proving her authority at every turn. Nothing happened without her approval, and her presence loomed like a shadow over every task, every decision, and every life. But the contrast between the house and the fields was stark. Inside the mansion, Margaret entertained guests with charm and grace. She glided through polished parlors, laughing at clever remarks, offering compliments, and maintaining the perfect image of the Southern matriarch. Outwardly, the Whitmore estate radiated refinement, elegance, and wealth. Yet beyond the gleaming floors and silvered chandeliers, fear and tension shaped every corner of life for those who worked the land. The plantation itself was carefully designed to reinforce hierarchy and authority. The house sat atop a gentle rise, overseeing the fields below. The enslaved quarters were tucked away at the edges of the estate, functional, simple, and stark reminders of the social order. Every pathway, every line of sight, every division of space served to reinforce Margaret's power. Her presence was felt everywhere, like an invisible hand shaping the lives of everyone who lived and worked there. Despite the harsh conditions, small acts of resistance and resilience quietly persisted. A child might steal a brief moment of laughter, a servant might pass a whispered warning, or a mother might teach her children secret prayers for protection. These tiny sparks of defiance reminded those living under her control that even in the shadow of fear, the human spirit could endure. And yet, the tension never fully lifted. The elegance of the mansion, the beauty of the grounds, and the poise of its matriarch couldn't hide the unease simmering in the quarters and the fields. Whispers, furtive glances, and careful movements were part of daily life. The plantation was a world built on power, fear, and control, where appearances mattered more than truth. And survival required constant vigilance. This was the stage on which Margaret Whitmore's story played out, a world of grandeur and beauty, yet shadowed by fear, secrecy, and the harsh realities of oppression. It was a place where her dominance shaped every moment, every life, and every choice, and where the consequences of her actions would ripple far beyond the polished halls of her mansion. Beneath the polished floors and sunlit fields of the Whitmore plantation, a darkness lingered, one that no visitor could see and few dared speak of. Margaret Whitmore's control over her household had always been absolute, but over time it twisted into something terrifying. Whispers began to spread quietly among the enslaved quarters, carried from one cautious voice to another. Some servants had noticed Margaret alone with her sons in ways that made them uneasy. Others spoke of children born under mysterious circumstances, their origins a secret guarded fiercely by the matriarch herself. Margaret had always been a woman of precision and order. She oversaw every task, corrected every misstep, and expected complete obedience. But her obsession with control began to invade the most private corners of her household. She treated her sons not just as children to guide, but as instruments of her will, shaping their understanding of authority and obedience in ways that would leave lasting scars. What began as strict parenting gradually turned into manipulation, a quiet distortion of morality and innocence that no one could openly challenge. The first signs of horror were subtle, almost imperceptible. Margaret would linger in certain rooms longer than necessary, watching children as though testing their reactions. She observed how people responded to her commands, how they moved, how they spoke. Gradually, the truth began to emerge. Margaret had been fathering children through her own sons, crossing boundaries that left everyone in her household trapped in fear, confusion, and shame. For the enslaved women, the reality was devastating. Many were coerced into complicity, caught between survival and moral despair. Mothers watched helplessly as their children were drawn into the household's twisted secrets. Fathers labored under the sun, powerless to protect their families from an abuse that was both intimate and deeply public in its consequences. Life on the plantation became a careful negotiation. Every smile measured, every word weighed, every glance calculated. Even Margaret's sons were caught in a web of obedience and manipulation. Raised to mirror their mother's exacting standards, they were drawn into a cycle they could neither fully understand nor resist. Refusing her was unthinkable punishment. Shame and social exile loomed over every choice. They complied, trapped by fear and by the unnatural lessons of authority that had shaped them from childhood. Margaret maintained her flawless public image. To visitors and neighbors, she remained the epitome of grace, entertaining with laughter, charm, and poise. No one could guess at the tension lurking behind the walls. The mansion hummed with music, conversation, and apparent harmony. But the truth of life inside was a heavy, suffocating weight. The corners of the estate whispered secrets in shadow, and every obedient smile carried the echo of fear. Rumors began to spread beyond the plantation. Traveling merchants, visitors from other estates, and even neighbors whispered about unusual patterns, children who seemed out of place, tensions in the household, and the ever-watchful matriarch. Fear kept many from speaking too loudly, but the undercurrent of suspicion was impossible to ignore. Even Margaret, careful as she was, could sense the shifting winds, the first signs that her secret might not remain hidden forever. Within the estate, the tension grew unbearable. Every glance, every word, every hidden gesture became a test of loyalty and silence. The beauty of the plantation, the elegance of the mansion, and the perfection of Margaret's public persona could no longer mask the horror beneath. In the shadows of the Whitmore estate, lives were being shaped by fear, manipulation, and corruption, leaving scars that would linger for generations. Life on the Whitmore plantation was measured in hours of labor, whispered warnings, and the constant hum of fear. Dawn came early, bringing with it the scent of earth and smoke, the soft rustle of movement through the fields, and the quiet determination of men, women, and children who labored tirelessly under Margaret Whitmore's watchful eye. Every step, every gesture, every word carried meaning. Misstep, hesitation, or question could lead to punishment. The enslaved quarters, tucked to the edges of the estate, were humble but alive with the quiet rhythms of endurance. Mothers rose before sunrise, tending to children while preparing the day's work. Fathers carried the burden of labor, hoping to shield their families from the worst of the overseer's punishments, though knowing that some dangers could not be avoided. Children, some not yet 10, fetched water, gathered firewood, or helped in the fields, learning early that life was about survival and silence. Margaret's reach was felt everywhere. She controlled not just work, but relationships, behavior, and even the smallest gestures of independence. Families were constantly monitored, alliances scrutinized, and every whisper of disobedience punished. Women endured a particular terror, forced to navigate both the demands of the plantation and the twisted influence Margaret had over her own sons. The children born from secrecy and manipulation became living reminders of the corruption within the household, and the enslaved could only watch in fear and despair. Even the children of the enslaved community learned quickly. Innocence was a fragile thing, easily broken by the harsh realities of labor and fear. They observed their world carefully, learning which questions were safe to ask and which actions might bring punishment. Every glance at the Whitmore family revealed the strange, unsettling balance between power, obedience, and survival. And yet, even in this world of strict rules and constant fear, small acts of defiance persisted. A mother might whisper a prayer in secret. A servant might quietly pass a morsel of food to a hungry child. A young girl might teach her friend a song meant to lift their spirits. These small acts of resistance, though fleeting, kept hope alive. They reminded the enslaved that even under the shadow of Margaret Whitmore's power, humanity could endure, but the fear was relentless. The fields carried the sound of footsteps measured by obedience, the crack of a lash for mistakes, and the soft sobs of a child punished for curiosity. Every moment was a careful negotiation between survival and the desire for freedom, however fleeting. Even laughter had to be measured. Every smile weighed against the consequences it might invite. Life under Margaret's control was a constant balancing act, a test of resilience in a world designed to strip away both dignity and hope, despite the hardship. The enslaved people preserved knowledge, culture, and courage. They maintained family bonds, shared stories and whispers, and found solace in small joys. These quiet acts of endurance became a way to survive and resist, even when the power of the plantation seemed absolute. They understood that the outward beauty of the mansion and the grace of the matriarch were illusions, carefully constructed to hide fear, manipulation, and suffering. Every day on the Whitmore plantation reinforced the harsh truth. Power without accountability could crush lives. Innocence could be stolen, and moral corruption could touch every corner of a household. Yet within this darkness, the enslaved carried the seed of hope, the unbroken human spirit. Their courage, resilience, and quiet resistance would leave a lasting mark, reminding future generations of the strength required to endure even the most unimaginable oppression. The first whispers started softly, almost like a breeze rustling through the trees, barely audible, easy to ignore. Travelers who had passed the Whitmore plantation spoke cautiously in taverns and at crossroads, sharing fleeting observations of a household that didn't seem quite right. Merchants returning from the estate would mention odd behavior in passing. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances at dinner parties. Even without details, a sense of unease began to grow, settling over the region like a shadow. Margaret Whitmore's control had always seemed absolute. Her home ran like clockwork. Every servant, every child, every movement accounted for. But the cracks in her carefully maintained facade were starting to show. Outsiders noticed unusual patterns: children who didn't resemble their supposed fathers, attention in the servants' movements, the strict watchfulness of Margaret herself. The plantation's outward charm only made the subtle signs of something darker even more unsettling. In town, gossip carried weight. Churchgoers whispered in corners, careful to lower their voices when mentioning the Whitmore estate. Shopkeepers quietly discussed rumors while tending their stalls, and travelers passing through relayed observations that seemed to hint at hidden secrets. Though no one could speak openly, suspicion spread like a slow fire, its embers glowing beneath the surface of polite conversation. Within the plantation itself, tension was growing. The enslaved servants noticed it. First, the way visitors lingered in certain rooms, the subtle questioning glances of neighbors, the soft murmurs that floated through the corridors. They had long learned the importance of silence, but even they felt the pressure mounting. Every glance, every word, every movement could reveal knowledge that was not meant to be known. Some whispered their fears quietly among themselves. Others clung to silence, aware that a single misstep could bring punishment or worse. Even Margaret's sons began to sense the shifting winds. Raised to obey unquestioningly, they were now forced to consider the possibility that the outside world might see what had long remained hidden. Their mother's influence had always been absolute within the walls of the mansion, but the world beyond was beginning to press against the carefully constructed boundaries of their lives. The household secrets could no longer remain entirely private. Margaret herself remained outwardly composed. She entertained with charm and grace, smiling at neighbors and visitors. appearing unaffected by the subtle shift in attention. But beneath her poise, she must have felt the first stirrings of worry. The whispers were no longer confined to the quarters. The rumors had begun to circulate in the broader community. Every visitor who lingered, every neighbor who asked questions, every quiet conversation carried the potential to expose her carefully hidden world. The pressure built silently, but relentlessly. Margaret's dominance, once unquestioned, was now at risk. Suspicion lingered like a storm cloud over the estate, darkening even the most sunlit rooms. Life on the plantation, already tense and controlled, became even more precarious. The stage was set for confrontation, revelation, and the consequences that could ripple through every life under Margaret Whitmore's shadow. The whispers had grown louder, and with them came the first real consequences. Inside the Whitmore mansion, tension had become almost unbearable. Margaret's sons, raised to obey without question, carried the weight of knowledge they were too young to fully understand and too afraid to challenge. Their childhood innocence had been replaced by confusion, guilt, and a sense of moral compromise. Every glance at their mother, every quiet word exchanged, reminded them of the unnatural lessons they had been forced to learn. For the enslaved people, the effects were even more profound. Families were strained, trust became fragile, and fear seeped into every corner of daily life. Mothers did what they could to shield their children, teaching them prayers, whispered songs, and lessons of caution. Fathers labored endlessly in the fields, hoping to protect their loved ones from harm, yet knowing that some dangers could not be avoided. Every day was a delicate negotiation between survival and dignity, a test of endurance in a world designed to strip both away. The broader community could feel the ripple, even if they did not yet know the full truth. Neighbors noticed subtle changes, the way Margaret's children carried themselves, the tension in the household, the whispered warnings exchanged among the servants. Church leaders and merchants could sense something was off, though social conventions kept them from speaking openly. The Whitmore name, once synonymous with wealth and respectability, now carried an undercurrent of suspicion that no amount of charm or propriety could fully erase. Margaret herself remained outwardly unshaken. She continued to host elegant dinners, entertain visitors with grace, and maintain the image of the perfect matriarch. But the cracks in her carefully constructed facade were becoming visible. Every visitor who lingered too long, every servant who watched too closely, every neighbor who whispered each represented a potential exposure of her darkest secrets. The illusion of control, once so absolute, was beginning to falter. The impact on her sons was particularly heartbreaking. Trapped between loyalty, fear, and the weight of morality, they struggled to reconcile the love for their mother with the knowledge of her corruption. They had been raised to obey, yet they now faced moral choices their upbringing had not prepared them for. Silence had kept them safe, but it could not erase the awareness of wrongdoing. Their world, carefully ordered and structured, was now filled with moral uncertainty and emotional turbulence. For the enslaved people, the consequences were both immediate and long-lasting. Children born into secrecy and fear were burdened by circumstances beyond their control. Families were fractured, and lives were shaped by events they could neither predict nor influence. And yet, even in the midst of such suffering, resilience persisted. Quiet acts of courage, whispers of hope, and small moments of defiance reminded them and us that humanity could endure even under the harshest oppression. The Whitmore plantation, once a symbol of wealth, order, and elegance, had become a testament to the human cost of unchecked power. The social and moral repercussions were spreading, touching not just the family, but the wider community, and leaving scars that would echo for generations. Margaret's choices had consequences far beyond her immediate control, proving that no amount of wealth, status, or outward charm could shield a household from the moral and emotional fallout of cruelty, corruption, and secrecy. To truly understand the story of Margaret Whitmore, we need to step back and look at the world she lived in. Virginia in 1853 was a place where wealth, land, and social status defined every interaction. Plantations like the Whitmore estate were more than homes. They were symbols of power, places where the lives of the wealthy were carefully orchestrated, while the lives of the enslaved were tightly controlled. Often invisible to the outside world, slavery was the foundation of this society. Men and women were considered property, stripped of basic rights, and subjected to the whims of their owners. Their labor fueled the prosperity of families like the Whitmores, yet their suffering was largely ignored or hidden. The grandeur of the estate, the charm of the matriarch, and the beauty of the fields were designed to mask a harsh and brutal reality. This is the world in which Margaret's abuses took place. A world that made secrecy possible and accountability nearly impossible. Margaret's control over her household was extreme, but it wasn't entirely unique. Many matriarchs and patriarchs wielded significant power in their homes. What set her apart was the moral corruption of that power. By manipulating her sons and coercing the enslaved women, she exploited both the social hierarchies and the silence that society demanded. Her actions were enabled by a culture that prioritized appearances over justice, wealth over morality, and authority over compassion. The society around her made it even easier to hide these abuses. Gossip existed, yes, but it was tempered by fear, social norms, and a reluctance to interfere in the affairs of the elite. Plantation life was insular, and outsiders were careful not to provoke confrontation. Even the clergy and local authorities, who might have spoken out under other circumstances, often remained silent, protecting the facade of respectability rather than seeking justice for the vulnerable. Gender roles also played a major part. While men held most legal authority, women like Margaret had enormous informal influence within their households. Matriarchs controlled the daily lives of children, servants, and the family's reputation. That influence, combined with societal complicity, allowed her abuses to go unchecked. Her power was invisible in many ways. It wasn't written into law, but it shaped every relationship, every decision, and every life within the Whitmore estate. Understanding this context helps us see why the horrors at the Whitmore plantation could happen and remain hidden for so long. The fear, manipulation, and trauma endured by the enslaved people were not anomalies. They were part of a system designed to control and dehumanize. Likewise, the moral corruption in Margaret's household was a product of a society where obedience, status, and secrecy often outweighed conscience and justice. The Whitmore estate, in many ways, was a microcosm of antebellum Virginia. It reflected the extremes of wealth and power, the invisibility of oppression, and the ways in which social structures could enable cruelty. Margaret's story is horrifying, yes, but it also serves as a lens through which we can understand the broader realities of her time. Behind the beauty and charm of southern plantations lay a world of suffering, control, and moral compromise, a world that left deep scars on everyone it touched. The story of Margaret Whitmore lingers long after the sun sets over the Whitmore plantation. The mansion still stands, the fields still stretch under the Virginia sky, but the shadows of her actions reach far beyond the walls. This was a household where wealth and beauty masked cruelty, where power was absolute, and where human lives were shaped, and sometimes broken, by obsession and secrecy. Her sons, raised under her strict and twisted guidance, carried the weight of complicity and moral confusion. Their lives were shaped by lessons they could neither fully understand nor challenge. They inherited more than land and status. They inherited the moral scars left by a mother whose power overshadowed their own humanity. The children born into secrecy and manipulation also carried the burdens of fear, confusion, and stolen innocence, reminders of the human cost of unchecked authority. for the enslaved people, the impact was profound and enduring. Families were fractured, trust strained, and lives forever altered. And yet, even in the darkest corners of the plantation, there were glimpses of resilience. Quiet acts of courage, whispered prayers, shared songs, and fleeting moments of joy became acts of resistance. They remind us that even under extreme oppression, the human spirit can endure. Margaret's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power. Wealth, status, and charm can create illusions of perfection, but they cannot erase the moral consequences of cruelty or the emotional scars left on those affected. Her legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that society's deference to power often shields wrongdoing, that secrecy can hide unimaginable abuses, and that the lives of the vulnerable are easily overshadowed by the influence of the elite. And yet, history also teaches us the power of endurance and memory. The enslaved people of the Whitmore estate, despite suffering unimaginable hardship, carried forward knowledge, culture, and courage. Their resilience lives on in the stories we uncover today. The past, though painful, reminds us that human dignity and spirit cannot be fully crushed. Even when the world seems determined to suppress them, as we reflect on this story, we are reminded that history is not just dates and events. It is about people, choices, and consequences. The Whitmore Plantation, with all its elegance and horror, serves as a mirror for the complexities of humanity: power and corruption, fear and resilience, secrecy and truth. The scars left by Margaret's actions touch hearts across generations, reminding us to honor the lives of those who endured, to acknowledge the truths long hidden, and to learn from the shadows of the past. Thank you for joining us on this journey into Virginia's hidden history. If this story moved you, opened your eyes, or made you reflect on the hidden corners of our past, consider subscribing to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments, and help us continue uncovering the stories that shaped America one truth at a time.